For practical reasons, it's probably good to have some guidelines in terms of how you can deploy AI, but I ultimately think, we've probably architected too many guardrails around context in traditional systems, and breaking those down can be incredibly helpful and act as an accelerant for your team.
Hey everyone, Matt Curl here with Apollo, and welcome to Rewiring Growth, a series where we pull back the curtain on how today's fastest growing companies are going to market in the age of AI. In this episode, I sat down with Jon Lexa from Sana, one of the teams redefining how knowledge and AI agents work inside the enterprise. We talked about why companies stall their own AI progress, how to balance a fast-growing product-led growth motion with large enterprise deals at the same time, and why context is the real competitive advantage in AI. This show is brought to you by Apollo.io, the end-to-end AI sales platform built to help modern sales teams grow. Now, here's Jon explaining Sana's unique approach to AI.
Our mission is to augment human intelligence with AI. It's an incredibly broad mission on purpose, and what that's resulted in us exploring and iterating and taking the market over the last 9 years have been products that help advance specifically employees' knowledge and learning, starting out with an AI-native learning platform that augments how onboarding works, reduces ramp time for sales reps, providing much more personalized sales enablement programs, and also the beloved compliance programs that nobody really likes to take, but with Sana, they can do them up to 50% faster. Underpinning that learning platform is an AI tutor, an AI coach, and also AI-assisted content creation. So you can get your learning programs launched and ready in 40 times faster than what it would traditionally take. We've also then launched an agents platform, and this one we're really excited about because it has the premise to rewrite how enterprise software works at scale and how access to knowledge works for enterprises. And then the last step that we're solving for now is agentic AI, where we allow users to set up multiple step workflows that tap into large language models that get the right context. They solve the search algorithm, and then they're able to connect to different tools and be able to execute multiple steps across processes that would typically be very manual or time-consuming in practice.
I can think back about, MindTickle or BrainShark and a lot of these tools that have been around forever. You see a lot of areas where AI has made promises of disrupting learning. And I think you saw, even large organizations like Bosch figure out early on how to maybe use some type of AI to help train their reps better or, do a support type of module. Well, I think what Sana's building is actually quite different. Disclaimer for anyone listening, we use the tool internally. I've been pretty blown away by the approach it's taken. How do you feel like internally when you all are thinking about solving this problem, especially with go-to-market? How are you building something net different? What is that magic delta between Sana and other products? And how do you all think about leveraging that product in such a way that it is something different and stands out in an otherwise very crowded space to actually live up to the promises and the hype around AI and all the places it can help you in your business?
It's a tough question, primarily because there isn't like that one magic thing. It ultimately, for us, it's a lot of small decisions that compound over time into something that's transformative. And I think, irrespective of our product, any product that's leveraging or that's incorporating, whether it's large language models or whether it's just like basic personalization recommendation algorithms or, AI avatars, I think the key is just to have an insanely stellar product engineering and design team that listens to customers, takes in their feedback, and builds products that are truly delightful. There's a lot of examples of incumbents that are getting pressure from the market or from their investors or their board to ship something with AI. And, to use the colloquial term, it's a bit like putting lipstick on the pig. But if you really want to build something that's transformative, you have to invest a lot of time and effort into finding out what are those small differences that, when put together, they ultimately drive something that's a lot greater than the respective parts on their own.
Definitely. I mean, I think even the current zeitgeist in the market is all AI, as you mentioned, and internally, we're even focused on making sure that AI products we launch have high adoption rates and high retention rates. We really don't want to launch something that's out there that's not for the benefit of our customers. And I love what you said there about it's not one thing. It's just sort of a habit of doing things right and taking in customer feedback. even thinking about your business, I know you all just unlocked a free tier and you've got massive explosion of new workspaces using your product now. Was that coming from listening to customers, or even applying the customer lens to how you think about go to market? Is that where that unlock came from? I'm just curious how you all got there, and congrats on the success of that, by the way.
Thank you. I'd say that was primarily driven by us internally having this desire to try something product-led and try something self-serve, even though, from the get-go, we've always been very much a sales-led organization. There's just this, and that speaks a bit to how we build Sana. We're ultimately driven by our own curiosity, and that curiosity can be enhanced by what customers or users are saying. That can be enhanced by, what we're reading at the time, or what products or what teams we're looking up to. But that was very much a curiosity-driven experiment that's turned out fantastically well. So I think, the lesson there is find time to explore that curiosity, and don't limit yourself to kind of the only thing that's working right now. And one thing I wanted to add on to your previous question, if I may, because I felt I was a bit vague. So, to take a specific example like our AI tutor, at its premise, you could say that it's a large language model with some RAG infrastructure, and that has the right context for somebody to learn a specific topic, whether that topic's how to give feedback, or how to negotiate, or how to align, how to do proper discovery. Those topics you can essentially give to a large language model and say, coach somebody on this. What comes together with thoughtful design and thoughtful product leadership is an experience where you might provide aspects of UI elements that people are familiar with, in order to not just give them a chat-based experience with that AI tutor, right? You might provide UI blocks, or you might suggest to the user up front, why don't you try Socratic reasoning, or are you ready to quiz yourself, or do you want to explore related topics? And so then it becomes more of a user experience problem, not necessarily how do we deploy AI problem solely in itself. And I think that's maybe where we spend a lot of time thinking about, which is what's the UI for AI going to look like in the future? Whereas maybe other products are solely focused on, let's just add some AI to our product and keep it in its existing shape, and then hope people adopt it.
It's a good way, I think, to approach your customer base as well, which is, how do I not just get you trapped into something that's a chatbot that I could ordinarily just deploy with GPT, but what actually makes learning different? One thing I particularly liked with Sana, as we've deployed it for a couple of corporate-wide trainings, has really been, you have to interact with it. It's really double-checking knowledge of our product. It's a lot of do it yourself and then send it for submission, and it sort of grades it on the fly. And I can tell that it's doing a lot of those types of, first I show you, and then we talk about it, and then you can ask questions, but then you actually go do the exercise. It grades in real time. It can provide feedback. And I think that it's a much more interesting environment that I think holds a lot more touch. And my only question over time is, how do you eventually just speed that up and get it so fast and out of the box? And I presume that's got to be one of the hardest design challenges you all are thinking through.
Yeah, I think speed and UI form factors, how do we not overdo the UI, or and UI I'm using a bit broadly. For example, a user experience challenge could be how do you give somebody enough context in that AI tutor experience so that you can help them, similarly to how the best teachers that we've ever worked with would help us, guide us along without necessarily giving us the answer. Whereas, nothing against ChatGPT, but a lot of folks at the job or in school are using ChatGPT just to get the answer, and then maybe they don't go through the painful experience of learning something, which then kind of reinforces their neurons and actually helps them build that memory over time.
It reminds me of prior conversations I've had with a lot of SDR leaders, actually, where we're noticing a pretty common trend, at least in the sales motion, where removing phone skills from them and just doing AI generated emails, and everything's ready to go. Here's what you're supposed to present on the call, and here's the content served up for you, and this is exactly what you're supposed to do next, is actually degrading the ability to think critically and solve the customer's problem, because it's just more multifaceted than, I saw this, go execute this plan. And when we're noticing reps or SDRs in particular fall into that trap, it's actually worsening outcomes, not actually accelerating them. It might look good on the short term, but longer term, it's not particularly helpful in coaching and developing people and teaching critical skills that are needed, I think, to succeed in the workplace. Sounds like you're finding something very similar there.
Yeah, 100%. And to steal the quote, I can't remember who said it. Maybe it was Steve Jobs, but we applied here like AI should effectively become a bicycle for the mind. And that's a beautiful analogy because you can go much farther with AI, but you still have to put in the effort to push the pedals.
You talked about the product part of your company and really that design principle of build good product. I want to really talk about your go-to-market motion and also what you're acquiring. Again, on that launch of, more of like a product-led growth type of ecosystem, it's had a huge success for your business. I also know in practice, both having deployed this at Checker, even at 5 stars before that, and definitely with Apollo, that also brings in a different customer type. And now I'm sure you're grappling with very different customer needs, likely on some that are very early in their journey or trying it out, or a really sharp person that's at a large organization and stuck with incumbent technology. And then you also have your traditional approach, which has worked with you all to date, and has been a great success story for Sana. How are you now balancing that, especially as a go-to-market leader, and also taking and synthesizing that feedback to product and not distracting the story? It's a totally new ICP that's emerged for you all. And I'm just curious, as a growth leader, how you think about now serving those different populations differently, or do you even segment them differently at all? I'm just curious what your approach is and what your current thoughts are there.
It's a never-ending discussion, that's for sure. I think it's good to reiterate your point around like very different needs. A self-serve user is naturally going to have very different needs than an enterprise user. What's important in these moments, and I'll be the first to say we're still learning as we go. But what's important is maybe to keep the team focused on what truly drives the needle, and then help them understand the context for why we might have other motions, and how those motions can be more long-term bets that we're taking. So even though, we have a self-serve motion that's maybe growing north of 10% month over month, we shouldn't necessarily let that distract us from a 7-figure enterprise deal that's going to drastically change the trajectory of our plan for the quarter, but then still carving out the context for why it's important that we explore these other bets.
As a leader of both an AI company that's doing learning and also now having this massive PLG success story behind it, what tips do you have for people listening in? Like, is there specific things or specific ways your team is using AI to capture the voice of all of these new customers, or to capture all of these insights so that you all can learn from your customers better? So more curious, like any tips or ideas you have about how Sana is cracking that code, and especially given the proximity of your product, I think you've got to be probably one of the furthest developed to answer this question.
We try to see everything as like context for a large language model, and truly everything. It could be meeting recordings, and there you have incredibly rich transcripts from customers, or it could be internal meetings where we're discussing strategy. It could be conversations in Slack, or operational data from product or from our CRM, and trying to unlock context for as many people as possible, I think is the ultimately the best thing. Because what ends up happening is, you get folks that are incredibly excited to experiment and test out AI. And the things that limit them in maybe other organizations is access to context, and like too much maybe red tape around what they can try and whatnot. And for practical reasons, it's probably good to have some guidelines in terms of how you can deploy AI. But I ultimately think we've probably architected too many guardrails around context in traditional systems, and breaking those down can be incredibly helpful and act as an accelerant for your team. And to give you a tactical example here, one thing that we've been exploring on is how we can integrate our agents product to use internally with Salesforce and give the agent essentially admin rights.
That's I think there's some RevOps people stressing out right now. Yeah, tell me more about this, Tim.
Yeah, so you give the agent access rights, admin rights, to effectively access all opportunity history data across the entire organization. And once you set that as the baseline, you're saying now, okay, now everyone has the context they need about an account, and it's so empowering, right? Then you can add guardrails on top of that to say, okay, maybe the agent shouldn't expose this information, or maybe they shouldn't expose that information. But the flip side is to try and build that in legacy systems that have pretty rigid governance guideline or like rigid access rights, and it's effectively impossible to give the right context to somebody to do their job. So where I'm going with this is, when we're deploying AI internally, I think we try to think through things from first principles and look at what's going to help accelerate the business and how can we enable people to be the best at what they do and just get out of their way as quickly as possible, but then add the guardrails as we scale and as we see things breaking to ensure that that we're not creating too much of a risk.
I like the approach there. It's fascinating that you said everything is context and everything is context for those models, and you try to think about the approach internally as maximizing the amount of context and information. I think that's the heart of probably why you're granting admin privileges as an example. It's not to do anything scary, but it's really to say we want all the information about this customer or this opportunity. We want the full history to do things intelligently. What are your thoughts on the barriers that most companies are facing insofar as do people in those points of leverage, for example, the Salesforce admins, the RevOps teams, these VPs of sales, do they have a good grasp on how AI actually works? And, what do you all think about just sort of as a platform in the space that focuses so much on this? How do you intend to think about democratizing or teaching the foundations of AI? Has that been something that customers are asking you for? Just curious what you're seeing there, if people even understand these ecosystems.
Of course, there's like tons of content that you can read up on and go through, and it's probably good to just stay abreast of what those are and what folks are saying. But ultimately, I think the most important thing is just to facilitate the experimentation and give people the tools to try themselves. I think that's one of the side benefits of our self-serve motion. Instead of having to tell people how AI works for them, we can just say, here, try it yourself. Here's a very easy UI to onboard to. You can take it for a spin. You won't hurt yourself. Go crazy and see how you can leverage it. And then they might share with their friends on how they're using or their colleagues. And then suddenly you get more of that bottom up user adoption and user education happening.
You think for all the customers you've talked with, maybe last question for me, and really just where you think is the single biggest opportunity you've seen with go-to-market teams. You're getting to talk to customers and companies all day about their challenges internally. And I know that AI is at the forefront of that, not just with what your product does, but I think where many people are struggling. And I think you have a very unique seat where you've seen so much of the space and you see these challenges, I'm guessing, on every customer call that you're on. And just curious where you think is the biggest opportunity for go-to-market teams as it pertains to AI right now.
Yeah, I'd say it comes back to building context, right? And that could be either through, the work that you're doing at Apollo and enriching data. That's ultimately context that's super valuable. And the more that we get of it, the better. Or it could be on what we're doing with providing people the right enablement and getting them the right information to be more effective at their jobs and building the skills that they need for the future. So the more that we can focus on delivering the right context, the better our lives are going to be.
Love it. I think it's a great story. Thanks so much, Jon, for joining me on. Really, really appreciate our conversation.
Likewise. Thanks, Matt.
That's a wrap for this episode of Rewiring Growth. If Jon's perspective on AI resonated with you, you can connect with him on LinkedIn or check out what the team is building at Sana.ai. We've got more great guests on the way, so don't forget to hit subscribe. And if you're looking to level up your go-to-market motion, head over to Apollo.io. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.